Hi there. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, whatever time it is. As always, happy whatever day it is, and welcome. I'm Larry Erickson. This is the Erickson Report. And we're going to start this time. I've got a whole bunch of stuff to get through. I'm not even sure I'll get through all of it, but I'm going to start, as I always like to, with some good news, which I have to admit was kind of hard to come by this time. But I did find two things I wanted to bring up. First is that on October 22nd, the United States District Court for the Northern District of California rejected an attempt by the Biden administration to keep in place a Tweetie-pie era Clean Water Act rule, which environmental and indigenous advocates argued would have devastated states' abilities to manage their own rivers. This June 2020 rule changed the Clean Water Act certification process in order to allow federal agencies to approve large projects, including fossil fuel pipelines, hydroelectric dams, industrial plants, wetland developments, and more, against and over the wishes of states and Native American tribes. The rule also established a one-year deadline for permitting decisions and also limited the factors that the state and tribal officials could consider in these projects. Washington Attorney General and co-plaintiff Bob Ferguson welcomed the ruling, saying that the Tweetie-pie administration, quote, did everything it could to yield to the interest of polluting industries. And now, and these are my words now, not his, they did it over the objections of the Biden administration, but that rule is no more. All right, the other thing is that on October 29th, the Supreme Court refused to block a vaccine requirement imposed on Maine healthcare workers. This is the latest defeat for opponents of vaccine mandates. The court had previously rejected challenges of such requirements for New York City teachers and Indiana University staff and students, but this was the first time it had ruled out a statewide mandate. The Maine mandate went into effect on October 1st, but the state gave until October 29th before it would be enforced to give people time to get the shot. As of November 2nd, Maine's four largest hospital systems reported that between 96 and 100% of employees were either vaccinated or had a valid medical exemption. And so that's good news. But since no good news could go unsullied, 3 days later, on November 11th, the global death toll from COVID-19, as tallied by Johns Hopkins University, had topped 5 million. Less than 2 years into a crisis that has not only devastated poor countries, it has humbled rich ones. Together, for example, the United States, the European Union, Britain, and Brazil, all upper middle or high-income countries, those together account for 1/8 of the population of the world, but nearly half of all reported deaths. In fact, the United States alone has recorded over 740,000 dead, more than any other nation. According to estimates from the Peace Research Institute Oslo, the worldwide death total from COVID rivals the number of people killed in battles among nations since 1950. COVID-19 is now the world's third leading cause of death behind heart disease and stroke. What's more, that total, that 5 billion total, is almost certainly an undercount because of limited testing and people dying at home without medical attention, especially in poor parts of the world, such as in India. I suspect the Grim Reaper is not feeling so grim these days. And by the way, after what seemed like a tsunami of news accounts about breakthrough cases where a vaccinated person tests positive for COVID, accounts that were used to attack the efficacy of the vaccines, recently released federal data sheds light on this. And what it came down to is exactly what you should have expected. Overall, fully vaccinated people had a far lower chance of testing positive for the virus or dying from it than the unvaccinated do. All vaccinated age groups saw similar rates of breakthrough infection, and they all had much lower rates of infection and death compared to unvaccinated people in those same age groups. As noted by Dr. David Dowdy, a public health researcher at the Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health, for any disease other than COVID, what would strike people most about these results is the dramatic difference between the unvaccinated and the vaccinated. But of course, this is not any other disease. This is COVID, which is as much a political disease as it is a medical one. Which leads me to end this segment with a wonderful comment from one Neil Truick. For decades, he said, it was no shirt, no shoes, no service. Nobody said a word. They had no mask, and people lost their damn minds. For decades, it was cover your mouth when you cough. Again, nobody said a word. Wear a mask, and it's grounds for insurrection. People fatigue me. Me too, my brother. Me too. All right, next up, we are going to take a slightly longer look at critical race theory, that academic law school discipline you've heard so much about, usually without or with a very confusing, jargon-laden explanation. So I'm going to try to give a little clarity here. To start, I'm going to take us back to September 22nd, to a Senate Judiciary Committee hearing on restoring the Voting Rights Act. At that hearing, Senator Ted Ooze tried to dismiss the impact of voter ID laws by demanding of a panel of witnesses if such laws are racist. And after having the one in Texas being cited as an example, he came back with, well, when I go to vote, they ask me for my ID. I pull up my ID, I show it to them, I vote. Is that racist? Now, the witness to who he addressed that particular question gave a proper and effective answer, but I refer to all this now because it occurred to me at the time that my answer would have been yes. Yes, not that the person is racist, but that the act is racist because it operates within a racist system. And then it later occurred to me that this could actually serve as a very, very basic, but still a basic illustration of what critical race theory is about. The Texas voter law was created and was found by a federal court to have been created with racist intent. Because although facially racially neutral, I mean, it doesn't mention race anywhere in the entire text, its designers used demographic data and historical trends to target for restrictions those methods of voting that were more likely to be used by non-whites than by whites, along with requiring types of ID that non-whites were less likely to have than whites are. In other words, the law was designed to make it harder for non-white people to vote than for white people to vote. So even though it appeared on its face to be racially neutral, the racism was baked into the law. If you were operating under that system, if you're trying to vote under that Texas law, you have two choices. You either don't vote or you participate in a racist system. You could be the most non-racist voter that ever walked the face of the earth, but still the system in which you operate forces you to operate in a racist manner. You don't have a choice. This is a very simple, it's even oversimplified example, but it serves to illustrate what critical race theory is about, how racism is built into the social structures and laws of our society. Now, another simple or, again, even simplistic, but still a useful example is redlining, the practice of denying various services to residents of minority communities based solely on where they live. The most notorious, but not the only examples, were involved like what interest rates someone would pay on a mortgage or some other form of credit, or even if they could get credit, based not on their personal circumstances, but on their address. There actually were examples of whether or not you were able to get credit. It depended on which side of a street you lived on, because that red line that the bank drew ran down that street. What happened is that in the previous decades, the history of racial discrimination in housing and employment had resulted in Black Americans being mostly confined to poor neighborhoods, lending itself to the superficially reasonable notion that living in those communities meant you were less creditworthy. So the housing patterns that were based on racial bigotry became locked in. And they persisted, and they still persist, even after redlining was at least supposedly outlawed. And I say supposedly because as recently as at least 2015, there were still banks that were paying out settlements because of their redlining practices. The point is that racial and racist patterns, structures that were created by white supremacy simply do not disappear on their own. And they do not cease to exist. They do not cease to operate. They don't cease to influence just because we are unaware of their roots. They are baked into the unspoken and quite often unaware assumptions about the law, about the economy, about the society which we carry in our heads and under which we operate. Those assumptions are what critical race theory looks to examine to get at the roots of the white supremacy that drove them. Because if those assumptions are to change, they must be examined, dissected, and actively overcome. Again, they are not going to go away on their own. Now, this doesn't mean that critical race theory is unassailable as a discipline, and indeed there are critiques of it. And I frankly have to admit that personally, I think reducing everything to race, as some of its proponents do, as if there were no other factors such as economic class involved, I think it's a little too simplistic. But at the same time, that does not mean that critical race theory is not a valuable tool. It also means that anyone who tells you that critical race theory is about how all white people are racist and it's about teaching kids who are white to feel guilty about being white, those people either have no idea what the hell they're talking about or they are lying through their damn teeth. There is no third option. And the fuss about it, on the one hand, is being promoted by people who are invested in maintaining their own power and position, who want to avoid any discussion of race at all, period, because they know an honest discussion will call into question their own privileged positions. And on the other hand, is being embraced by those who are being distracted by the latest shiny penny from what is really impacting their lives, or who are reluctant to examine their own assumptions because they are fearful of what they will find. That is evil on the one hand and tragic on the other. And it's time for us to take a break. And we're back. And we are back with one of our occasional features. It's called Noted in Passing, where we just touch on a couple of things pretty quickly. First up, this is a picture of Eric Zemmour, a rabble-rousing television pundit in France, who's finding an audience for his anti-Islam, anti-immigration invective and may run for president. Now, the sickening similarities to Tweetie-pie aside, what I wanted to point to is, for lack of a better term, smile. Does it ever strike you that all of these reactionary bigots, no matter who they are, no matter where, all seem to have the same sort of supercilious, self-satisfied smirk? That creepy, haughty expression that looks like Hannibal Lecter after a good meal? Seriously, watch for it. Seriously. All right, here's something to cheer you up. Not. It seems that in a closed-door meeting on October 26th, Democratic leadership advised House progressives that even as Build Back Better was on the verge of being gutted beyond recognition, they better start acting like they're getting a major win, whatever shreds of tattered cloth finally emerge from this. If we don't act like we're winning, the American people won't believe it either, according to House Majority Leader Steny Hoyer. So progressives should, according to Speaker Nancy Pelosi, embrace this and have a narrative of success. In other words, instead of campaigning against the lobbyists, the grifters, the corporations, and their enablers, cough, Manchin, cinema, cough, just lie and proclaim there's an awful lot of good in this package, even though you'd be hard put to find anything in there that impacts the corporations or the rich. That is, anything in there that they wanted out. That is, we can have whatever small gains or incremental improvements we want, so long as the interests of our overlords continue to get priority. It can be really depressing. All right, next, quickly noted because it's a topic that requires a fuller treatment, but I wanted to note that during the oral arguments at the Supreme Court on that insane Texas anti-choice law, the one that says that you can't sue the state to stop it because the state's not the one enforcing it. Instead, it's a vast sea of potential plaintiffs suing anyone in any way connected with abortion, so you'd have to deal with all of them one at a time. Well, at the oral arguments about it, a couple of justices who voted in September to allow it to go into effect appear to be having second thoughts. Barret accused rapist Kavanaugh and Amy Bugs Bunny Barrett both had skeptical questions for the lawyer from Texas. And with John Roberts, who I still think looks at cases with an eye to how the Roberts court will look to history, he voted to block the law while appeals continued. So the result is a switch by either of those Trumpite wackos would block the law. Now, this wouldn't be the end of it. First, because there's no time frame for a ruling, and who knows how many lives will be ruined in that time. But at least it should put a hold on other states, such as Ohio, already considering their own version of a ha, can't touch us ban on abortion rights. Finally for this, we have an RIP. Mort Sahl, a trailblazing political satirist with a biting wit whose rapid-fire monologues earned him the nickname Rebel Without a Pause, died on October 26th in Mill Valley, California. He was 94. In 2011, his 1955 album, Mort Sahl at Sunset, was cited as the first stand-up comedy album and was named by the Library of Congress to the National Recording Registry. Unhappily, by the 1970s, Sahl had come to be seen as a conspiracy kook and had lost most of his audience, particularly after he worked for New Orleans District Attorney Jim Garrison, whose claims about a wide-ranging conspiracy among anti-Castro activists and the CIA to assassinate John Kennedy eventually came down to a single indictment against a single businessman named Clay Shaw, who was acquitted by the jury in less than 1 hour. Sahl didn't return to Broadway himself until a one-man show in 1985, but credit where it's due, he remained a contrarian his entire life. A favorite quote from Mort Sahl: "Liberals feel unworthy of their possessions. Conservatives feel they deserve everything that they've stolen." Indeed. R.I.P. Mort Sahl. All right, next up, one of our regular features. This is called 2 Weeks of Stupid, Clowns and Outrages. And we start, as we normally do, with some clowns. In fact, though, this one, it's sometimes a little hard to say whether something should be regarded as a clown or an outrage. And here's a good example of it. So our first clown is an unnamed teacher at Ridgefield Memorial High School in Ridgefield, New Jersey. On October 18th, Mohammed Zubi, a Muslim Arab American who's a senior at the school, asked for an extension on completing a math assignment. The teacher responded with, "We don't negotiate with terrorists." Shortly after making the comment, the teacher supposedly told Zubi that he didn't mean it like that, which made me think, exactly in what way did you mean it? A supporting clown award, by the way, goes to the school administration, which initially dismissed this as a personal matter. Only after the incident became known through social media did the school board take it seriously. A couple of days later, the district said it's conducting a full investigation and that the teacher in question has been suspended until further notice. Next up, on October 26th, following Premier Joe Manchin's event at the Economic Club of D.C., 3 climate hunger strikers confronted him on his demand to cut climate provisions from the reconciliation package. Premier Manchin replied by asserting, quoting, "The United States has done more than any other country. All emissions are coming from Asia," unquote. Next up, Texas Republican State Representative Matt Krause has a 16-page list of roughly 850 books he tends to investigate if Texas school libraries might be harboring some of them. Krause has used his position as chair of the House Committee on General Investigating to dispatch a letter asking school districts to report whether they have any copies of any of these named books, and if so, to report how many of them they have and how much they spent to get them. Beyond such titles as The Confessions of Nat Turner by William Styron and Between the World and Me by Ta-Nehisi Coates, the list seems, well, actually not at all oddly obsessed with LGBTQ plus titles and ones about reproduction. A peek under Crouch's mattress might be interesting. Next, a reporter at the St. Louis Post-Dispatch uncovered a flaw in the website of the state's Department of Elementary and Secondary Education that left Social Security numbers for 100,000 staff members vulnerable. The information was contained in the HTML source code for the site. The paper notified the agency and held the story until the agency had a chance to rectify the error. But it does seem true that no good deed goes unpunished, because Missouri Governor Mike Parson is vowing to prosecute the staff of the paper, charging they are hackers who decoded the source code to uncover this data. He claims such an investigation would cost taxpayers $50 million, which is an absurd figure. And the thing is, the source code for a website is easily available to anyone with at most a couple of clicks. Try it. Go to your browser, look at a site, any site you want, look at the tools menu, and there's something to the effect of view source code or something like that. In fact, if your browser is Firefox, hit Control-U and see what happens. In other words, all of this proves, and all it does prove, is that Mike Parson has absolutely no freaking clue what hacking is. And I love this one because it gets back to the true nature of clown. All right, next, moving on to the outrages. Here are 6 civil society organizations in the West Bank. Adamir offers legal aid to prisoners, collects data on incarcerations, including so-called administrative detentions, which means they're held with no trial, and also works to end torture. Al-Haq documents violations of Palestinian human rights in the occupied territories. The Palestinian branch of Defense for Children International monitors the killing of children and the well-being of children imprisoned in Israel. The Union of Agricultural Work Committees aids Palestinian farmers, mainly in Area C of the West Bank, which is under Israeli control. Then there's the Union of Palestinian Women's Committees, and finally the Bisson Center for Research and Development, which describes itself as seeking to contribute to building an effective democratic civil society. Beyond that they work in the occupied territories, these 6 groups have one thing in common. On October 19th, the Israeli Defense Ministry labeled them all terrorist organizations, based on an unsubstantiated claim that they are secretly controlled by the Militant Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine. Under Israel's 2016 counterterrorism law, these human rights organizations now face the possibility of mass arrest, being shut down by the Israeli government, and in fact, anyone identifying with the groups can also be subject to imprisonment. Reaction to this was swift. Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International issued a joint statement calling it appalling and unjust, and an attack by the Israeli government on the international human rights movement. An Israeli government that has, again quoting the statement, for decades systematically sought to muzzle human rights monitoring and punish those who criticize its repressive rule over Palestinians. 21 Israel-based civil organizations joined in a statement calling the move a draconian measure that criminalizes critical human rights work and an act of cowardice characteristic of repressive authoritarian regimes. The United Nations Human Rights Office in Ramallah called it the latest development in a long stigmatizing campaign against these and other organizations. The U.S.-based Jewish Voice for Peace said it was an attack on all Palestinian rights and an obvious attempt to evade accountability, and called on its supporters to flood Congress with outrage. The editors of the Israeli daily Haaretz labeled a destructive folly and a stain on Israel. adding that the outlawing of human rights groups and persecution of humanitarian activists are quintessential characteristics of military regimes in which democracy in its deepest sense is a dead letter. There is, the editor said, a straight line from defining the nonviolent struggle against the occupation as diplomatic terror, which in fact Israel has done in the past, and designating human rights groups as terrorist organizations. A coalition of nearly 300 U.S.-based social justice groups urged the Blond administration to immediately and unequivocally condemn this shameful attack on human rights, noting that calling your opponents terrorists is, quoting again, a dangerous, well-worn tactic of authoritarian regimes. There was more, but that should make the point that the international civil and human rights community has had more than enough. Several of the statements said that one of the reasons Israel thinks it can get away with this is precisely because it has gotten away with so much for so long, which is painfully true, and just as painful is the undeniable fact that the U.S. has long been Israel's prime enabler. And yes, this is most definitely an outrage. All right, next, on August 25th, 2020, Kyle Rittenhouse shot 3 people in the streets of Kenosha, Wisconsin. Joseph Rosenbaum is dead. Anthony Huber is dead. Gage Grosskreutz is still recovering. Grosskreutz, rather, is still recovering from a severe wound. But according to Judge Bruce Schroeder, presiding over the trial of Rittenhouse, none of those 3 people are victims, or at least none of them can be called victims during the trial. The word victim is a loaded word, said Schroeder. Alleged victim is a cousin to it. That is, the terms are too inflammatory, too prejudicial to be allowed. Now, there are ways around this, and people have already suggested some, but what moves this from an ordinary, silly, legalistic argument is what Schroeder said those men who were gunned down could be called by the defense. He told defense counsel that in closing arguments, the 3 can be called looters, rioters, and arsonists, even though none of them have been charged, much less convicted, of any such crime, or indeed any other crime related to the events surrounding the shooting. That is, in Schroeder's court, victim is out of bounds even in reference to the people Rittenhouse is on trial for shooting, but looters, rioters, and arsonists are entirely reasonable descriptions of men who have been charged with nothing. I will be blunt, I find it beyond hard to believe, hard to accept, that having a baby-faced white boy on one hand and 3 young black men on the other is not a major factor in an operation here. And even if I'm wrong about that, this is still an utter and complete outrage. And with that, I have to say we're done. I'm out of time. So I've got more. I'll get to it next time, hopefully some of it. But for the moment, you do the best you can. You have the best 2 weeks you possibly can. We will see you then. And until then, as always, peace.